The courtroom was silent, but the weight of humiliation filled every inch of the space. The officer stood tall, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His smirk was a dagger, sharp and deliberate. He paced before the jury, eyes flicking between them and the woman sitting at the witness stand. His voice dripped with mockery as he gestured toward her with exaggerated disdain, savoring the moment, drinking in the power of the room. "You expect us to believe this nonsense," he scoffed, his voice thick with condescension. "Look at her. Just look. This is what we're dealing with, ladies and gentlemen. A woman with no credibility. No authority. Just another face in the crowd, another liar trying to play the victim. This is what they do. They twist the story. They cry oppression when they get caught. And now, she's sitting here, expecting us to take her word over mine. Over the badge. Over the law." The gallery murmured. Some shook their heads. Others smirked. The power dynamic in the room was clear, him, standing tall, commanding attention, controlling the narrative, and her, sitting quietly, swallowing the anger rising in her throat. But she wasn't just angry. She was calculating. The officer turned, glaring at her with the kind of arrogance that only comes from knowing the system will always back you up. His voice lowered, condescending and venomous. "You think you belong here? You think you can just walk into this courtroom and demand to be heard? You are nothing. You are nobody." He leaned forward, his voice now just above a whisper. "And nobody listens to people like you." The word struck like a slap, reverberating through the silence. The jury avoided eye contact. The judge remained impassive. The humiliation settled like a thick fog. But she didn't flinch. She didn't tremble. She sat there, eyes locked on him, unwavering, as if memorizing every syllable, every movement, every ounce of arrogance dripping from his stance. Because he had no idea who he was talking to. He thought he was humiliating a powerless woman, another black face in a system designed to silence her. He thought he was playing the role of the enforcer, the gatekeeper, the untouchable force of law. What he didn't know, what no one in the room knew, was that she wasn't just a witness. She wasn't just another woman, another name in a case he barely cared about. She wasn't powerless. She was the one who signed his paychecks. She was the one who had spent months preparing for this moment. She was the one who had orchestrated every move leading up to this very second. And in just a few moments, his entire world was about to come crashing down. But not yet. Not now. Because she wasn't done letting him dig his own grave. The officer chuckled, shaking his head, turning back toward the jury. "You know what the worst part is?" he continued, his voice booming. "They love this. The attention. The pity. It's all an act. She walked in here today, thinking she could play the victim. Thinking she could stand in front of all of you and pretend to be something she's not. Silence. Heavy. Unbearable. And then, finally, she spoke. Her voice was calm, even, steady. "Are you finished?" The question cut through the air like a blade. The officer's smirk faltered for just a second, but he recovered quickly, scoffing. "Excuse me. You've said a lot," she continued, her gaze locked onto his, unwavering. "You've put on quite a performance. But there's one problem." "And what's that?" he sneered. She leaned forward slightly, her hands still folded, her voice quiet but unshakable. "You have no idea who I am." The room shifted. A flicker of uncertainty passed through the officer's eyes. The air grew thick with anticipation. The murmurs started, whispers rippling through the gallery, the jury shifting in their seats. Even the judge arched an eyebrow, sensing something was about to unfold, something no one in this room was prepared for. For the first time since this whole show began, the officer's confidence wavered. His fingers twitched. His jaw tightened. Because suddenly, this wasn't going the way he expected. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. And in just a few seconds, he was about to find out exactly what. Before we dive into today's story, we want to take a moment to say this loud and clear: Plow of Twist stands against all forms of racism, discrimination, and injustice. This channel is a space where powerful stories are told, where truth matters, and where voices that have been silenced for too long get the justice they deserve. To every Black viewer watching this, you are seen, you are valued, and you are powerful. This story is not just fiction, it's a reflection of the real struggles that too many have faced. But more importantly, it's about strength, justice, and turning the tables. Now, sit back, get ready for a roller coaster of twists, and enjoy the story. Make sure to subscribe to Plow of Twist and turn on notifications, so you never miss a moment. Let's get into it. The morning light filtered through the towering windows of the courthouse, casting long, fractured shadows across the marble floors. The hum of murmured conversations, the occasional rustle of papers, the heavy footsteps of attorneys pacing nervously, everything about this place reeked of power, of a system that had long decided who belonged and who didn't. It was a building built on centuries of judgment, a place where truth was supposed to prevail but often got buried beneath influence, prejudice, and privilege. At the heart of it all, sitting stiffly in the front row of the courtroom, was Aisha Carter. She exuded a quiet strength, the kind that came from years of learning how to navigate a world that had been designed to keep people like her in their place. Her suit was perfectly pressed, her posture impeccable, but her presence alone was enough to make certain people in that room uncomfortable. She wasn't like the others who had walked in before her, intimidated, desperate, pleading for justice from a system that had never been built for them. She was calm. Too calm. She knew how these proceedings worked, how men in uniforms like Officer Daniel Whitaker operated. She had studied them, watched them, built her career around knowing their weaknesses. Whitaker was the embodiment of the kind of cop who had always thrived in places like this. Tall, broad-shouldered, blonde hair neatly combed back, a jaw that clenched slightly whenever he was forced to interact with people he deemed beneath him. He had the kind of face that exuded authority, the type that suburban parents trusted, that juries instinctively believed. But beneath the surface, there was a smugness, an unshakable belief in his own untouchability. He wasn't just confident, he was convinced that he was invincible. He had spent his entire career patrolling the neighborhoods he didn't live in, stopping people who didn't look like him, deciding who was guilty before they had a chance to speak. He had built his reputation on control, on ensuring that people like Aisha Carter knew their place. And today, standing in the middle of the courtroom with his uniform perfectly pressed and his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights, he was going to make sure everyone saw just how much power he had. The case that had brought them here was, on the surface, unremarkable, just another hearing, another day in a system where cases blurred together, where faces became statistics. A theft accusation, minor in comparison to the heavier crimes that usually occupied these halls. Aisha was called in as a witness, though from the moment she stepped into that courtroom, it was clear that Officer Whitaker had no intention of treating her as such. To him, she wasn't a professional. She wasn't someone whose voice mattered. She was just another Black woman trying to play smart, in a world where men like him dictated the rules. The air was thick with expectation as the proceedings began. The judge barely looked up, uninterested in the spectacle that was about to unfold. The jury, hand-selected from a pool that always seemed to favor people who saw the world the way Whitaker did, settled in with the detached indifference of those who had already made up their minds. The prosecutor was young, ambitious, eager to prove himself in front of the right people. He asked his questions carefully, with the precision of someone who knew that there were unspoken boundaries in a courtroom like this. But then Whitaker spoke. And from the moment his voice filled the room, it became clear that this was not going to be a simple exchange of facts. This was going to be something else entirely. He didn't just answer the prosecutor's questions, he performed. He smirked. He scoffed. He turned toward the jury with exaggerated expressions, throwing in casual remarks meant to sway them, to make them laugh at Aisha's expense. He didn't see a witness in front of him. He saw an opportunity. An opportunity to remind everyone exactly who was in charge. Aisha sat perfectly still as he mocked her. She had seen this before. She had lived this before. The way his voice dripped with condescension, the way he gestured toward her like she was an exhibit in a trial rather than a person, the way his smirk widened when he realized that no one was going to stop him. This wasn't about the case anymore. It was about proving a point. It was about making sure she knew that no matter how she dressed, no matter how articulate she was, no matter how calm she remained, she would never be seen as his equal. The words he chose were sharp, deliberate. He questioned her credibility. Her intelligence. Her right to be sitting there at all. He didn't just try to discredit her, he tried to humiliate her. The courtroom was supposed to be a place of order, of law, but in that moment, it had become his stage, and he was playing the lead role in a performance that was as old as the system itself. Aisha could feel the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on her. She could hear the barely concealed chuckles from the jury, the way some of them avoided looking at her altogether. She could see the judge shifting in his seat, uninterested in the power play unfolding before him. This wasn't new. It had happened 1,000 times before, in 1,000 different ways. And yet, this moment, this particular moment, felt heavier. Because this time, Whitaker had no idea who he was talking to. This time, the script wasn't going to end the way he thought it would. He continued, his voice laced with arrogance, his words carefully designed to strip away any semblance of dignity she might have had left. But what he didn't realize, what he was too blinded by his own entitlement to see, was that Aisha wasn't just sitting there taking it. She was waiting. She was letting him dig his own grave, letting him push himself further and further into a hole that he wouldn't be able to climb out of. And soon, very soon, he was going to learn exactly what kind of mistake he had made. The tension in the courtroom had shifted, subtle but undeniable. Officer Daniel Whitaker still stood tall, still smirked, still basked in the confidence that came with years of unchecked authority, but there was something in the air now. A shift. Something he couldn't quite name, something that should have made him stop, reassess, take a step back. But men like Whitaker didn't step back. They pushed forward, doubled down, convinced that their version of reality was the only one that mattered. He was still speaking, still throwing words like weapons, his voice thick with disdain, addressing the jury as if he were sharing an inside joke that only they would understand. You see, people like her, they come in here and expect you to believe whatever story they spin. They count on sympathy, on that automatic reaction that tells you, oh, she must be telling the truth. But let's be honest here. How often is that really the case? How often do we see this kind of thing and later find out, oh, what a surprise, things weren't exactly as they seemed? He turned back toward Aisha, his smirk widening. Tell me, Miss Carter, have you ever lied under oath before? Have you ever bent the truth to fit your agenda? The way he said her name, stretching it out just slightly, twisting it in his mouth like it was something distasteful, something foreign, was intentional. Everything he did was intentional. A calculated performance designed to strip her of credibility, of power. The jury watched, some leaning forward, waiting for her to react. But Aisha didn't react. Not yet. She folded her hands in her lap, tilted her head slightly, and let him continue. Because the deeper he dug, the harder it would be to climb out. Whitaker chuckled under his breath, turning back to the jury. Notice how she doesn't deny it. Interesting. Very interesting. Because let me tell you something, folks. I've seen this before. I've seen it 100 times. People like her always have a way of making themselves look innocent. They've mastered it. And if we're not careful, we'll fall for it. But not today. Not in this courtroom. The words landed heavily, each one like a nail in a coffin he didn't realize was his own. The judge remained quiet, indifferent. The prosecutor, young and overeager, didn't intervene. It was a spectacle now, a public undressing of a woman who had dared to sit before them and speak. And Whitaker? He was reveling in it. Aisha finally shifted in her seat, her first real movement in minutes. She glanced at the judge, then at the prosecutor, then back at Whitaker. Her expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes now, something that should have made him stop. But he didn't. Nothing to say, Miss Carter. No emotional outburst. No last-minute plea for the jury to see you as the victim. He crossed his arms, his confidence swelling, his voice thick with mockery. Come on. Give us something. Show us a little fire. Or is it that you don't have anything left to say now that I've laid it all out for everyone to see? For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The courtroom, once filled with murmurs and shuffling papers, now held its breath. Waiting. And then Aisha smiled. It wasn't big. It wasn't theatrical. Just the smallest, subtlest curve of her lips. But it was enough. Whitaker's smirk faltered. She leaned forward slightly, finally breaking her silence. Are you done? Her voice, calm and composed, was the opposite of what he had expected. No anger, no desperation, no defensiveness. Just control. Complete, undeniable control. Whitaker scoffed, rolling his eyes. Oh, please. Spare me the dramatics. If you had anything worth saying, you would have said it by now. She nodded slowly, as if considering his words, before letting out a soft breath. Interesting. You know, Officer Whitaker, I've spent a lot of time studying men like you. That got his attention. He blinked, just once, the smallest flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Excuse me. Men who think their badge makes them untouchable. Men who walk into rooms like this and assume that because they're the ones standing, the ones speaking the loudest, the ones making the accusations, that they're the ones in control. Men who don't realize how blind they are until it's too late. The room was silent again. Whitaker's smirk was gone now, replaced by something else, something he couldn't quite hide. The feeling of losing control, the feeling of something slipping through his fingers. Miss Carter, if you have something relevant to say, I suggest you say it, the judge finally spoke, though his tone was half-hearted at best. Aisha's eyes didn't leave Whitaker's. She let the moment stretch, let him sit in that silence, let him feel the weight of what was coming. Then, with the ease of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long, long time, she leaned back in her seat and said, You have no idea who I am. The words were quiet. Simple. But they sent a ripple through the room. Whitaker frowned. What the hell is that supposed to mean? She didn't answer immediately. She let him sit with it. Let the uncertainty sink in, let the first seeds of doubt take root. And then, slowly, she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small, polished badge. Whitaker's face changed. The badge gleamed under the harsh courtroom lights, its emblem unmistakable. It was the badge of a chief of police. The realization hit like a shockwave. The jury's murmurs started again, louder this time, confusion and disbelief spreading through the room. The prosecutor's pen slipped from his fingers. Even the judge finally lifted his head, eyes narrowing. Whitaker took a single step back. No, he whispered, barely audible. But Aisha heard him. And for the first time since she had walked into that courtroom, she let herself smile. Just a little. Because the real game was about to begin. The room was no longer the same. The power balance had shifted so suddenly, so violently, that it left a lingering weight in the air, thick and suffocating. Whitaker's entire demeanor had changed, the cocky arrogance that once shaped his every word now cracked, splintered, barely holding together under the crushing realization of what had just happened. The badge in Aisha Carter's hand wasn't just an object, it was a weapon, a declaration, a death sentence for everything he had built his confidence on. For the first time, he was speechless. The jury was no longer looking at Aisha as if she were just another black woman in the courtroom, another face to dismiss, another name to forget. No, now they were staring at her with wide eyes, shifting in their seats, realization dawning in slow, painful waves. The judge, once so indifferent, sat up straighter, suddenly invested in the scene unfolding before him. The prosecutor looked as if he had been struck, eyes darting between Aisha and Whitaker as if trying to process the sheer magnitude of what had just been revealed. Whitaker took a step back. Then another. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, struggling to regain his composure, to pull himself out of the hole he had so confidently dug. This has to be some kind of joke, he forced out, though his voice betrayed him. Aisha simply tilted her head, watching him the way a predator watches its prey. Do I look like I'm laughing? The words landed like a slap, sharp and precise. Whitaker's face twitched, his fists clenching at his sides. His mind was scrambling for a way out, for a justification, for some way to twist this back in his favor. There's no way. I would have known. I would have seen, you would have what? Aisha interrupted, her voice still calm, still composed. Stopped yourself from humiliating me. Watched your words a little more carefully. Treated me with the respect I deserve. Interesting. Because none of that should depend on my title, Officer Whitaker. But for someone like you, it does, doesn't it? Silence. Whitaker's jaw tightened. His body language screamed discomfort now, shoulders stiff, muscles locked as if trying to hold himself together. The courtroom wasn't his anymore. The audience wasn't on his side. He wasn't the commanding presence he had been just moments ago. He was shrinking. You don't belong here, he spat, though the venom in his voice lacked the weight it once carried. You don't get to decide where I belong, Aisha cut in smoothly, her tone unwavering. Not here. Not anywhere. She leaned forward, placing the badge carefully on the table in front of her, letting it sit there, gleaming, undeniable proof that everything he had assumed, everything he had built this little show of his around, had been wrong. Let me explain something to you, Officer Whitaker, she continued, her voice never rising, never needing to. For months, I've been investigating corruption within the police department. Discrimination. Abuse of power. Officers who think they're above the law because no one has ever held them accountable. You are not just a name on my list. You are the list. And you did all the work for me today. Every word you just said, every insult, every ounce of arrogance you threw in my face, it's all documented. Recorded. Witnessed. And now, it's not just me who sees it. Everyone in this room sees it. Everyone out there will see it. Whitaker's skin had gone pale. You set me up. Aisha raised an eyebrow. You set yourself up. I just gave you the stage. The weight of those words settled over him like a boulder, his breath coming out heavier now, more labored. He turned, searching for an ally, someone to step in, to take his side, but no one moved. The judge watched with an unreadable expression. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, clearly debating whether or not he should intervene. The jury sat frozen, some leaning back as if they were afraid to be too close to the fallout. For the first time in his career, Daniel Whitaker was alone. You think you can just ruin me? His voice wavered, though he tried to inject it with the same authority he once carried so effortlessly. You think this changes anything? You think people like me don't walk away from things like this all the time? Aisha simply watched him, letting his own words sink in, letting him hear himself. You just admitted it, she said softly. Right here. In front of everyone. You just confirmed what we all already knew. Whitaker's nostrils flared, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again, but nothing came out. Aisha leaned back, giving him space to drown in his own panic. You spent this entire trial talking about power. About who has it and who doesn't. And now that you don't know what to do with yourself. You're done, Officer Whitaker, she continued, finally standing. And this time, you don't get to control the narrative. This time, you don't get to talk over the people who have been silenced for too long. This time, you don't walk away without consequences. Whitaker took another step back, looking more lost than he had ever been. He glanced toward the judge, toward the prosecutor, toward the jury, as if hoping, desperately hoping, that someone, anyone, would throw him a lifeline. But no one did. Aisha turned to the judge, her voice clear, unwavering. Your Honor, I'd like to submit the following evidence to the court. A full report, compiled over months, detailing Officer Whitaker's misconduct, abuse of power, and repeated racial profiling cases. And I have more. Witnesses. Documentation. Proof. Today was just the final nail in the coffin. The judge's gaze flickered toward Whitaker, unimpressed, unmoved. Proceed. The gavel hit the wood. Whitaker inhaled sharply, realization setting in, fully, painfully. Aisha Carter had just destroyed him. And there wasn't a single thing he could do about it. The weight of the judge's decision hung in the air like a storm about to break. The courtroom was no longer just a place of law, it was a battlefield. And in that moment, Officer Daniel Whitaker knew he had lost. But losing wasn't something men like him accepted easily. His chest rose and fell with unsteady breaths, his fingers twitching at his sides. He had built his entire career on control, on walking into rooms like this and dictating who had a voice and who didn't. Now, he was the one struggling to speak. His eyes darted to the prosecutor, to the jury, to the judge, searching, desperate, silently pleading for someone to step in, to intervene, to undo the catastrophe unfolding in front of him. But all he found were cold stares, indifference, a quiet understanding among them that they were watching a man drown in his own arrogance. Aisha Carter remained standing, her posture firm, unwavering. She had been waiting for this moment, not just today, but for years. Watching men like Whitaker operate unchecked, knowing how easily they twisted reality to suit their power. Knowing how many people had suffered under that unchecked power. And now, watching him unravel, watching the confidence drain from his face, she felt no satisfaction, just inevitability. Whitaker let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. This is bullshit. This is a setup. A witch hunt. You think you can come in here, wave your little badge, and suddenly I'm the bad guy? No. No, that's not how this works. His voice cracked, just a little, and he knew it. His control was slipping, the walls he had built so carefully now caving in around him. Aisha simply watched him, her expression unreadable. You think I did this to you? Her voice was quiet, steady, but there was an edge to it now, something razor-sharp beneath the surface. You did this to yourself. You walked in here today thinking you owned this courtroom. You spoke with the kind of confidence that only comes from knowing no one has ever held you accountable. But today, that changes. Whitaker let out a sharp, bitter laugh, but it held no real amusement. You think this is going to change anything? You think one hearing, one case, one moment like this is going to tear me down? You're delusional. You think I don't know how this system works? It's bigger than you. Bigger than me. People like me, we survive. Aisha took a slow step toward him, closing the space between them just enough to make sure every word she said landed exactly where it needed to. People like you survive because no one has ever been willing to fight back the way I am. Because every time you've gotten away with this, the people you've humiliated, hurt, abused, they didn't have the power to stop you. But I do. And this time, you don't get to walk away. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. His entire body was tense, like a cornered animal realizing there was no way out. You think you're better than me, don't you? You think just because you've got a title, just because you played the game well enough to climb the ranks, that you're untouchable? His voice lowered, dark and sharp with anger. Let me tell you something, Chief Carter. This city, it doesn't want people like you in charge. They tolerate you. That's all. The moment you stop being useful, the moment you make them uncomfortable, poof. You're gone. Just like that. Aisha stared at him, unmoving. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? That this system will always protect you, no matter what? That you're invincible? She let the silence stretch for a moment before shaking her head. The truth is, Whitaker, you were never as powerful as you thought you were. You just had the illusion of power. And now that illusion is gone. Whitaker's breathing was heavier now, uneven. He was unraveling. And the worst part? He knew it. He could feel it happening, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. You really think this is justice? His voice was raw, desperate now. You think ruining my life makes things right? Aisha tilted her head slightly. Did you ever ask the people you humiliated if they thought what you did to them was justice? Did you ever wonder how many lives you ruined with a smirk on your face, with your badge as a weapon? Or is it only now, when it's happening to you, that it feels unfair? Whitaker exhaled sharply, his hands curling into fists. He had nothing left. No words that could twist the narrative, no allies in the room willing to throw him a lifeline. The power he had wielded for so long had evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a man stripped bare in front of the very system he had once used to destroy others. The judge cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. Officer Whitaker, do you have anything else to say before I make my ruling? For a moment, it seemed like Whitaker might try one last time to reclaim his control. His lips parted, but then he saw the jury, saw their expressions, their judgment, their certainty. He saw the prosecutor, avoiding eye contact, unwilling to fight for him. He saw the cameras, the reporters in the back of the room who would take his every word and turn it into tomorrow's headline. He saw the end. His mouth snapped shut. He exhaled slowly, shoulders sinking. Aisha didn't look away. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply waited. The judge nodded. Then I think we're ready to proceed. Whitaker's hands twitched at his sides. He looked at Aisha one last time, and for the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, his eyes held something they had never held before. Fear. Real, unmistakable fear. Not because of what she had done, but because of what came next. The weight of the moment had sunk into the very walls of the courtroom, pressing against the air itself, thick and unmoving. It was as if the entire space had been frozen in time, each person inside it caught in the wake of something irreversible, something that had already happened but was still sinking in, dragging them down with it. The tension was no longer just lingering, it had solidified, made itself at home in the eyes of every single person who had just witnessed the unthinkable. Aisha Carter stood firm, her shoulders squared, her chin held high, her gaze unwavering. The controlled composure she had maintained throughout this entire process had not wavered, not even once, and even now, after everything had unraveled before them, she remained unmoved. But beneath that control, beneath the steel in her spine, there was something deeper, something heavier, a resolve so deeply ingrained that it had become part of who she was. And across the room, standing stiff and motionless, was Daniel Whitaker. But he was not the same man who had strutted in earlier that day, brimming with arrogance, dripping with condescension, radiating the kind of untouchable authority that only came with years of believing in your own immunity. No, that man had started to fracture the moment he realized who he had been talking down to. The moment he saw that badge in her hand, the moment he felt the weight of his own words turning against him, the moment he understood that this was no longer his courtroom, no longer his stage. Now, that same man stood as a ghost of himself. His hands hung stiffly at his sides, fingers twitching slightly as though he was resisting the urge to clench them into fists. His eyes darted around the room, searching, scanning, desperate for something, someone, to step in, to undo the irreversible, to throw him a lifeline. But there was no one left to save him. He had spent his entire career walking into rooms like this and deciding who had power and who didn't, who was heard and who was silenced, who mattered and who was disposable. And now, for the first time in his life, he was standing on the wrong side of that equation. The judge, who had previously observed everything with an air of impartiality, was now sitting straighter, his expression unreadable but firm. His fingers tapped against the stack of documents before him, the weight of the decision already made, the verdict already reached. Given the overwhelming evidence presented, the judge finally spoke, his voice even but carrying the force of finality. It is the determination of this court that Officer Daniel Whitaker be suspended from active duty, pending a full internal investigation into his conduct. Furthermore, in light of the serious allegations against him, including repeated misconduct and abuse of authority, I am formally recommending the revocation of his badge and firearm, effective immediately. An independent review of his previous cases will also be conducted to determine the full scope of his actions. The sound of the words landing, of the finality sinking in, was deafening. Whitaker barely moved, but his entire body had stiffened like a wire stretched to its breaking point. The room was watching him, dozens of pairs of eyes drilling into him, absorbing the image of a man who had built himself up so high only to crumble right where he stood. His breathing had become heavier, more erratic, his nostrils flaring slightly as if he was trying to control the anger that had been simmering beneath the surface since the moment he had realized he had lost. "This is a mistake," he muttered under his breath, but the words held none of their former confidence. They were raw, shaky, an automatic reaction rather than a statement of fact. "You don't even have the full story." Aisha's gaze didn't waver. "We have more than enough." Her voice was steady, calm, carrying none of the malice that he would have used had their positions been reversed. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't reveling in his downfall. She was simply stating the truth. And that truth was the sharpest blade of all. Whitaker's lips curled slightly, but it wasn't a smirk, it was something else, something closer to a snarl, a last-ditch attempt to hold on to whatever scraps of dignity he had left. "You think this makes you better than me?" His voice was low now, almost a whisper, but it carried a venomous edge. "You think this makes you a hero? It doesn't. It just makes you another part of the system. This system eats people alive, Carter. It chews them up, spits them out. Today it's me. Tomorrow, it's you." Aisha studied him for a moment, letting his words hang in the air between them before finally responding, her voice even softer than his. "The difference is, I've never been afraid of accountability." Whitaker inhaled sharply, his teeth clenching. He looked around the room again, but nothing had changed. The jury was still there, unmoving. The judge was still watching, waiting. The attorneys, the press, the gallery, silent observers, taking in every moment of his fall from grace. "You don't get it," he said, his voice more desperate now, more raw. "You think people like me don't survive things like this?" He let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "I'll be back. You hear me? This doesn't end here." Aisha stepped forward, not aggressively, not confrontationally, but with the quiet kind of certainty that was more terrifying than any raised voice. "Not this time." And for the first time since this had begun, Whitaker finally seemed to understand that there was no way out. The bailiff approached him now, slowly, as if giving him the chance to process what was about to happen. Whitaker looked down at his chest, at the badge pinned there, the symbol of everything he had built his power on. It was the last thing he had left, the last shred of the identity he had spent years crafting, the shield that had protected him from consequences his entire career. And now, it was being stripped away. His fingers trembled as they reached for it. He hesitated. Just for a moment. Then, with a sharp motion, He yanked it from his uniform and threw it onto the desk with enough force that it clattered loudly against the wood. His gun followed, landing with a dull, heavy thud beside it. And then, without another word, he turned and walked. He didn't look back. Didn't acknowledge the reporters who were already scribbling furiously, capturing the moment that would soon become headlines. Didn't meet the eyes of the jury members who had once listened to him with trust. Didn't stop as he passed the attorneys who had once seen him as an ally, now turning away, unwilling to be associated with his downfall. He walked out of the courtroom, through the doors, and disappeared down the hallway. And just like that, the illusion of his power was gone. Aisha exhaled slowly, a breath that carried years of battles fought, of injustices witnessed, of moments just like this one where the scales had tipped just enough to make a difference. This wasn't the end. There was still so much more to do. So many others like Whitaker still hiding behind their uniforms, still believing they were untouchable. But today, in this room, in this moment, something had shifted. And that was enough. The courtroom had begun to empty, but the weight of what had just unfolded still clung to the walls, to the floor, to every single person who had been in that room to witness the moment a man who once thought himself invincible was stripped of his illusion of power. The reporters whispered among themselves, their pens moving furiously across their notepads, already shaping the headlines that would circulate by morning. The attorneys spoke in hushed tones, glancing at Aisha Carter as if seeing her for the first time, as if only now understanding the depth of what she had just done. The judge had already left, his final words sealing Whitaker's fate before stepping out, leaving behind the aftermath for everyone else to absorb. Aisha remained standing, her posture still poised, her breath slow and controlled, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins was relentless. This was a victory, yes, but it wasn't the kind that brought relief. It was the kind that left a mark. The kind that reminded you that battles like these never truly ended, that even when one man was held accountable, there were dozens more waiting to take his place, still convinced that the system would shield them as it always had. But today, for the first time in a long time, someone like Whitaker had been forced to face the reality of his actions. And that was enough. For now. She felt the presence of someone moving closer before she saw him. The prosecutor, James Holloway, approached with careful steps, the usual confidence he carried now dampened by something else, hesitation, maybe even discomfort. He was young, ambitious, the kind of man who had learned how to navigate the legal system with precision, but today he had been caught in the crossfire of something much larger than a routine case. He cleared his throat, standing just a few feet away, his hands tucked into his pockets. "That was something," he finally said, his voice low, almost careful. Aisha turned to him, her expression unreadable. "Something," she echoed, watching the way he shifted slightly, as if unsure of where he stood in all of this. Holloway exhaled, glancing toward the emptying rows of seats where the jury had once been. "I won't lie to you," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "When you first walked in, I thought this was just another case. Another hearing. I didn't see it for what it was. But you did. You saw the whole picture before anyone else did." Aisha studied him, her gaze unwavering. "And now that you see it?" she asked, her voice measured. Holloway let out a short, humorless chuckle. Now I wonder how many more Whitakers there are that we just let slip through the cracks. How many more of them think they can walk into a room like this and twist the truth until it bends to their will? How many people like you have had to sit there and listen to men like him dictate reality, knowing they'd never be held accountable? Aisha tilted her head slightly, watching the way he spoke, the way he seemed to be processing all of it in real time. "And what are you going to do about it?" she asked, not out of judgment, but out of genuine curiosity. Holloway inhaled deeply, letting the question settle between them before answering. "I don't know yet," he admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I do know that after today, I can't pretend not to see it anymore." That was something, at least. She nodded, accepting his words for what they were, before finally shifting her gaze toward the back of the room, where a familiar figure had been watching quietly this whole time. Deputy Chief Marlon Hughes. A man she had worked with for years. A man she trusted. He met her eyes, offering a slow nod, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had transpired. She walked toward him, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, stopping just a few steps away. He looked at her, his expression calm but knowing. "You did it," he said simply. Aisha let out a slow breath. "For now." Hughes studied her for a long moment before responding. "It's not over, is it?" She shook her head. "No. It never is." He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You know, when you first told me what you were planning, I thought you were out of your damn mind. Going in alone, letting him talk himself into his own grave. I thought it was a risk we couldn't afford to take." "And now?" she asked. Hughes gave her a small, knowing smirk. "Now I see that it was a risk we couldn't afford not to take." She looked away for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle. The exhaustion was starting to creep in now, slow and inevitable, pressing at the edges of her control. But there was still one thing left to do. One final loose end. "Where is he?" she asked. Hughes didn't need to ask who she meant. "Downstairs. Waiting for whatever comes next." She nodded, already turning to leave. "Aisha," Hughes called after her, making her pause. She turned back, waiting. He hesitated for just a second before speaking. "You sure you want to do this? He's already lost. You don't owe him anything." Her lips pressed together, her expression unreadable. "I know," she said, her voice steady. "But I need him to know it, too." She walked out before he could say anything else. The hallways of the courthouse were quieter now, the chaos of the hearing left behind in the courtroom. She made her way down the corridor, down the stairs, each step deliberate, purposeful. She knew what she would find when she got there. And she was right. Daniel Whitaker sat on a bench, his hands clasped together, his posture slouched in a way that made him look smaller than he had ever been. He wasn't in handcuffs, not yet, but he looked like a man who had already lost everything. He didn't look up when she stepped in, didn't acknowledge her presence. But she knew he knew she was there. She stood in front of him, silent at first, waiting to see if he would say anything. When he didn't, she finally spoke. "You spent your whole career believing that the badge made you untouchable," she said, her voice calm. "And now that it's gone, you don't know who you are without it." Whitaker exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You think you've won something here?" His voice was quieter now, hoarse. "You think this changes anything?" Aisha studied him. "It changes everything." He finally looked up at her then, his eyes hollow, empty. "You don't get it. I was one of the good ones." She let the silence stretch before answering. "If that were true, we wouldn't be here." His jaw clenched, but he didn't argue. He couldn't. They both knew the truth now, and there was no running from it. She took a step back, her voice steady. "I didn't do this to you, Whitaker. You did it to yourself. And now, you have to live with it." She turned, walking away, leaving him there with nothing but his own reflection in the cold, unflinching reality he had built for himself. And for the first time, Daniel Whitaker had no power left to wield. The quiet hum of the courthouse basement filled the space with an eerie stillness. The walls, thick and cold, seemed to absorb the weight of everything that had just transpired. Aisha Carter stood near the doorway, watching Daniel Whitaker as he sat slouched on the bench, his hands gripping his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor. His once pristine uniform was wrinkled, his badge gone, his presence stripped of the authority he had wielded so recklessly for years. He was just a man now, no longer the enforcer of power, no longer the one who dictated who deserved respect and who didn't. Just a man, sitting alone in the silence he never thought he'd have to face. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant murmur of voices upstairs, the courthouse still buzzing with the fallout of everything that had just unfolded. Aisha had seen men like him before, men who had built their entire existence around their belief in their own invincibility. But what made Whitaker different was the way he had unraveled. It wasn't just the loss of his badge that had shaken him. It was the realization that for the first time in his life, he had been powerless. When he finally looked up at her, there was no anger in his eyes. No smugness. No arrogance. Just exhaustion, just the hollow emptiness of someone who had spent too long believing in his own lies. "You still here to gloat?" His voice was rough, quiet, as if the words took effort to push out. Aisha didn't move, didn't shift under his gaze. "If I wanted to gloat, I would have done it in the courtroom." Whitaker scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah. That was something, wasn't it?" He let out a humorless chuckle, rubbing his hand over his face. "Damn. You played me. I walked right into it." She folded her arms, her voice measured. "No. You walked into it all by yourself." His jaw tightened slightly, but he didn't argue. He exhaled sharply, his hands rubbing against his thighs, restless, unsettled. "You know what's funny? I really thought I was one of the good ones. Spent my whole damn career telling myself that. Believing it." He let out another bitter laugh, his shoulders sagging. "Maybe that's the worst part." Aisha tilted her head slightly, watching him. "And why is that?" He exhaled, shaking his head. "Because it means I never even saw it. Never thought twice about it. The way I talked. The way I acted. The way I looked at people like you." He clenched his jaw, shaking his head again, as if disgusted with himself. "I thought I was doing my job. I thought I was keeping order. And maybe at first, I was. But somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing people. I started seeing threats. I started seeing problems. And the more power they gave me, the easier it was to convince myself that I was always right." Aisha didn't respond right away. She let his words settle, let him sit in the weight of his own confession. Men like Whitaker rarely admitted to their faults. They rarely acknowledged the cracks in their own armor. And yet, here he was, stripped of everything that had once made him untouchable, finally seeing himself clearly for the first time. "You ever think about the people you did that to?" she asked finally, her voice quiet but firm. His expression darkened, and for the first time, he hesitated. "I don't know," he muttered, running a hand over his mouth. "Maybe I tried not to. Maybe I told myself they deserved it. That I was just doing what needed to be done." He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. "But sitting here now, thinking back on all the people I humiliated, all the people I belittled, all the people who sat across from me the way you did today." He clenched his fists, his voice barely above a whisper. "I see their faces now." Aisha studied him, searching for any trace of the man he had been just hours ago, the man who had stood in that courtroom, grinning, confident, convinced of his own superiority. But that man was gone. What remained was something else entirely. Something broken. "You ever wonder what it's like to sit on the other side of that badge?" she asked, watching the way his body tensed at her words. "To be the one being judged before you've even had a chance to speak. To be the one who has to swallow your dignity because you know no one will listen to you. To be the one walking into rooms knowing people like you already decided who you are before you open your mouth." Whitaker's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He inhaled deeply, exhaling slowly, like a man trying to process something that had never even occurred to him before. "I guess I never had to." She nodded slightly, letting his own admission sit between them for a long moment. "And that's the problem." He rubbed his face again, letting out a breath that sounded like defeat. "You gonna tell me I deserve this?" Aisha's expression didn't change. "I don't have to." Whitaker scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah. I guess not. Silence stretched again, long and heavy. For the first time in his life, he had nothing left to say. No defense, no excuses, no justifications. Just the harsh reality of the man he had been and the consequences of his choices finally catching up to him. Aisha watched him for another moment before shifting slightly, turning as if to leave. But then she hesitated. She glanced back at him, her expression unreadable. "Change doesn't start when you lose everything," she said, her voice quieter now, but still firm. "It starts when you decide to see the truth. When you stop running from it. When you stop convincing yourself that the world is exactly the way you need it to be." Whitaker didn't respond, but the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders dropped, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, she knew he had heard her. She took a slow step toward the door, pausing just before reaching it. "You wanted to know if I think you deserve this," she said, glancing back at him. "I think you deserve to face what you've done. And I think you deserve the chance to decide what kind of man you want to be after that." For a long moment, Whitaker didn't move, didn't speak. Then, finally, he let out a slow, ragged breath. He looked down at his hands, as if seeing them for the first time. "I don't even know where to start." Aisha held his gaze for just a second longer. "That's not my problem to solve." And with that, she walked out, leaving him behind to figure out the answer for himself. The door clicked shut behind her, and for the first time in his life, Daniel Whitaker was left with nothing but the truth. The courthouse was behind her now, but Aisha Carter could still feel the weight of what had happened within its walls pressing against her skin, lingering in the back of her mind like the final echoes of a storm. The sky above was painted in the deep, fading hues of the evening, the last remnants of sunlight stretching across the horizon, casting long shadows over the city. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, inhaling deeply, the cool air filling her lungs as she closed her eyes just for a second. Not out of relief, but out of acknowledgement. Because this was not just the end of a case, it was the culmination of years of battles fought in silence, of injustices swallowed whole, of countless moments where people like her had been forced to endure, to bite their tongues, to walk away knowing they would never get the justice they deserved. But today, something had shifted. Today, the system had been forced to look itself in the mirror. And for once, it had blinked first. She exhaled, slowly, before descending the steps. Marlon Hughes was waiting near the bottom, hands tucked into his pockets, watching her with that quiet, steady gaze he always had. The two of them had known each other for years, had seen more than their fair share of victories and defeats, but tonight, there was something different in his eyes. Respect, maybe. Or something heavier, an understanding of what this moment truly meant. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low. Aisha gave him a small nod. "Yeah." He studied her for a beat before nodding back. "You did good today." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she let her gaze drift over the street, over the people walking by, unaware of the battle that had just been fought behind those courthouse doors. "It's not over," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. Hughes let out a breath, shaking his head. "It never is." Aisha turned back to him, her expression unreadable. "But at least now they know we're watching." A slow smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Damn right." The sound of footsteps approaching pulled their attention away. James Holloway, the young prosecutor, was making his way toward them, his movements hesitant, uncertain. The confidence he had once carried so naturally in the courtroom had been tempered, reshaped by what he had witnessed today. When he reached them, he paused, shifting slightly as if trying to find the right words. "Chief Carter," he started, then stopped, shaking his head before exhaling. "Aisha." She raised an eyebrow, waiting. He hesitated again, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck before finally looking at her. "I wanted to say thank you." Aisha frowned slightly. "For what?" "For making me see it," he said, his voice quieter now. For forcing me to see it. I walked into that courtroom today thinking I understood the system. Thinking I knew how justice worked. But I didn't. Not really. I saw it today. And I can't pretend I didn't. Aisha studied him, watching the way he carried himself now, the way his entire demeanor had shifted. She could tell he meant it. That he wasn't just saying the words to make himself feel better. That for the first time, he had been forced to confront the truth of the world he had spent his career working in. And that truth had shaken him. You have a choice now, she said, her tone even. You can either pretend today didn't happen, go back to the way things were, keep playing the game the way it's always been played. Or you can do something about it. Holloway exhaled, nodding slowly. I know. Then make sure you don't forget it. He gave her a small, solemn nod before turning and walking away, disappearing into the night. Aisha watched him go, knowing that whatever he did next would be entirely up to him. But at least now, he could no longer claim ignorance. Hughes let out a low chuckle beside her. Damn. You really know how to leave an impression. Aisha smirked slightly. That's the idea. They stood there for another moment before Hughes sighed, stretching slightly. Come on. Let's get out of here. Aisha nodded, and together, they walked away from the courthouse, the night swallowing them whole. Somewhere else in the city, in a small apartment that now felt far too empty, Daniel Whitaker sat alone, staring at the badge that had once meant everything to him. It lay on the table in front of him, stripped of its authority, reduced to nothing more than a hollow emblem of the man he used to be. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for a bottle, pouring himself a drink, though he barely tasted it. The echoes of his own voice haunted him, the words he had spoken with such confidence now ringing hollow in his ears. He had spent his life believing in his own righteousness, convinced that he was untouchable, that the world would always bend to men like him. But the world had changed. And now, he was just another name in a long list of men who had fallen from grace. The worst part was knowing that he had done it to himself. Aisha Carter didn't think about him again that night. She had done what she needed to do. And tomorrow, she would wake up and do it all over again. Because this fight was never over. It never would be. But at least now, for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were finally taking the first steps towards something real. And that? That was enough. Now, let me ask you something. How many times have you seen men like Whitaker? How many times have you watched people like him get away with it, walk away unscathed, untouched, unbothered? Today, it was different. But how many people had to suffer before we got here? How many voices were silenced before one was finally heard? That's the question we should all be asking ourselves. Because justice isn't just about what happens in a courtroom. It's about what happens when no one's watching. It's about what we choose to see. And what we refuse to ignore. If this story made you think, if it made you feel something, then let's keep this conversation going. Leave a comment below, share your thoughts. And if you want more stories that make you question, that make you reflect, that make you see the world just a little differently, make sure you subscribe to Tales of Twist. Because trust me, this is just the beginning.